All right, my dudes, let's get into this. I'm going to get this shared out to the folks online. Let's switch over to the main camera. Make sure you guys can see me. Happy Friday. This is going to be a good one. We're going to go through, and I've been looking forward to this one. I've been looking forward to this live stream for a while because it's such a pivotal moment in this space. For somebody that's been in it for a long time and seeing it's now finally starting to resonate for a general consensus of how do we operate as a world with cryptocurrency when it comes to like the regulatory frameworks and the interaction with current business, why it's been going on and it's just people are working through it without any regulation. It's the aspects that we're about to walk through of on those regulated environments. How does that capital get exposure to it? People that don't research and rely on, the system to help provide answers on where to go with their money. Those, trust funds, sovereign wealth funds, all those areas, all the way down to the rank and file when it comes to just banking relationships and having like a bank account and the ability to now potentially, have this stuff really accessible where you're already pre-KYC'd is going to be an interesting next few months when it comes into how is this all going to go down. We're going to peel back all of the things in today's live stream. It should be a really good one. And I'm actually going to bring up like a draw.io. We're going to be kind of building live, if I was like king for a day, how I would go about doing it. And we'll see what kind of comes out, from those, if it's the regulatory groups, if it's the Crypto Advisory Council, we're talking about the strategic Bitcoin stockpile, where do I see those kind of, I would call it the best in class execution. And it really comes down to any kind of like normal project management thing. We're going to talk through like personnel selection. How's that going to work? How's the transition strategy work related to integrating it with a, like an existing financial teams? We're talking treasury, we're talking all these different groups. How does that transition team start to integrate some of those discussions? How mechanically would it work? We'll get into that. And then what are the core critical path elements? How do you actually get it? Like people can get into a room and talk about it, but who's actually going to go and do the execution aspects of it? So we're going to peel that back. We're going to peel back essentially personnel, transition, and critical path. There are way more nuance to it, but I will bring up what I think is going to happen. And then we can kind of go back and review, like where I thought things were going to go, why didn't they go, that kind of thing. So hopefully you guys get tucked in, ready for this one. Essentially the agenda, we're going to make sure that's in the description below so you guys can see kind of a outline of what I've put out there with just kind of what's the core goals of each of what the campaign promises were, and then how do you go about doing it. So I've already kind of compiled a pretty decent list. That's a link below. We're going to update and add more to this related to essentially the hierarchical design of, I think, the way the team makeup's going to be. And this is just me speculation. I have no inside information, my dudes. This is more my understanding of how government works, being a solution architect in a lot of different aspects of things that have been deployed, have been worked into the government from the DoD to GovCiv, had experience in all that. So how would I assume that this structure is going to come out? So let's get into I think we have enough to get kind of started. The breakdown of what we're going to be covering today. So essentially we're going to first start with the Bitcoin strategic reserve, the stockpile. How's that going to function and work? Then we'll get into the SEC chair replacement. I mean, there's going to be multiple. I don't think it's just going to be SEC. But we'll kind of talk through the government agencies that could be affected by this, and then kind of how that's going to shake out. And then the Bitcoin and Crypto Advisory Council, kind of what should be made up in that. How does that structure? How should that structure look? In my opinion, that I think would be enough broad stroke to tackle the industry on interaction and on ramp points for technical on, and that technical could branch out into like from exchange services to AML, KYC onboarding from like onto banks, how the OCC, there's components that are going to have to be figured out, how that interaction with FINRA registration, stuff like that, to things that are going to be left as they are. And I think this is going to be a light touch. Well, I'm hoping it ends up being a light touch regulatory framework, but there's still a framework. And that's really where I think the Coinbases of the world and everybody are looking for, like how to interact on like the exchange. How are banks going to interact? How is custody going to work on banks? Are they going to be using API services to current exchanges? How's all that kind of structure going to work? And then the technical aspects when it comes to mining, on grid, off grid. Is there going to be some kind of new tax forms? Well, like what's that going to look like structure wise? We'll get into that breakdown advisory council side. Then more specific to mining, like there's the advisory council, which will hold, the hardware, the software, cybersecurity, all those kind of things. But then you get into like Bitcoin based mining strategies. And how does that look on public infrastructure? How does the private sector look on that? Where, private development, infrastructure development towards substations, those sorts of things. And then how does that interweave with the existing on-grid schedules, how it came to form? I think there'll be some discovery first on that, where they actually peel it back, and then look at where it makes sense. And what I mean by that, and we'll get into more of the detail, is currently and right now, just in our own experience, we have sites that are on what would be effective critical infrastructure. They're setting on substations that also support a given area. They're on their own trunk, so they would not necessarily affect anybody downrange. However, if that substation has an issue, how's that work with other residents and commercial businesses and that sort of thing, outages, all that kind of thing, curtailments. But then we also have had experience, and you guys have seen on our channel, where we've went out and gotten access to actual power plants on power plant grounds. We've had to go through all the registration process. Essentially, when you do that kind of thing, you get at least a pre-vetting that goes all the way up to the FBI as an example, because they want to know who's on a power plant, right? Like you can't just walk onto a power plant. There's all kinds of security aspects you have to do. And then how does that work from like a crypto mining aspect, maybe on public utility power plants where you're so close and they actually act as regulation for like the power systems, right? So when it's not being used, they're still using demand. When there is peak demand, you can shut down those units, but they happen to be on the power plant itself and act as a consumer of those, of that power, which then does support like expansion on any kind of green energy work, where if you're talking like windmills, solar, you don't necessarily have to take all of it straight to battery. You have a consumer that's just pulling that in, right? You have that consumption counted for. So how is that going to work when it comes into Bitcoin mining US, and how does the regulations get set up for support of that? So then there's at least an avenue for people to approach at that level. And this could be joint ventures. This isn't, I know a lot of people are going to be like, oh, this is more centralization of the mining. It's not. When you look at our aspect, we're working with joint venture. We're working with other hedge fund folks to build facilities for private placements, for individuals, all the way down to an individual company, to an individual that are participation. So we see our role as supporting the on-ramping and onboarding of those individuals or companies to have their own stake in this process. Then you have publicly traded miners, which are taking capital from public and deploying that capital in a various range of ways. They may buy power contracts or buying at scale, and it's just a different type of power contract structure, consumption structure, all of that. So it's a little different, and plus there's a lot more regulatory requirements on a publicly traded company because they also are selling shares on behalf of their company. So different aspects, but again, it's like a thread that's over the Bitcoin mining deployment kind of aspect. So we'll talk Bitcoin mining, energy stuff, and then ultimately, what's the impact of like Fed's continuing to low rates, and what is maybe the strategy from the administration, the new coming administration, when it comes to inflation. And then you hear a lot of discussion with President-elect Trump on leveraging Bitcoin strategic reserve to then have borrowing capital, or like as Bitcoin goes up in value, they're able to buy down the debt. Now that would require them to sell part of that. So it's like, where's the money come from type of thing, where if Bitcoin, they have a strategic reserve and then exercise the Bitcoin that they will have for payment of debt, right? So it's a transfer of value there. So as it's went up, it gives them the ability to start to buy down debt because Bitcoin's going up and you have Bitcoin. So, but it would be the government having a strategy to sell or divest, or in lieu of maybe new purchases and stuff, it's done against the margin of Bitcoin that they are willing to leverage. So there is some strategies on that. We'll talk through that too. So let's get into this, my dudes. We should have a pretty good crew. Hopefully this time's work for you guys. Next week, we're going to be on the Ravencoin cruise with Tron Black and some folks with talking the assets and expansion of assets on something like Ravencoin, UTXO coin. It's been around for a long time, has the same kind of history when it comes to like Bitcoin deployment. It's white paper released, fair market launch coin. We're going to be talking about that next week on next Friday's live stream. So make sure you're the same time, same channel. Hopefully we're going to be on a cruise, so Starlink should work, but we'll play it by ear if it needs to get moved into the weekend. So let's get into this. So the very first core thing that I want to talk to today is the Bitcoin strategic stockpile that is being talked about. So essentially, quick recap on Twitter, I had posted what we were going to talk about today. That strategic stockpile, I think, is kind of one of the more key aspects and one of the first mover things that I think can be done, because there is a current supply of, U.S. Marshal enforcement actions that have got cryptocurrency through illicit actions. They typically take that through they'll go through sales of these items. It's asset and recovery in general, just the normal process. If there's, bad behavior in some way, or somebody's done something illicit and they are prosecuted, and the asset and forfeiture process that's part of that activity. If you've done something illicit and they come in and you effectively forfeit those assets because they're considered ill-gotten gains, meaning you leveraged a position that was illegal and those gains happened because of those actions. They consider that is forfeiture. So then that goes into asset and forfeiture holder. If there's, it's stolen or ill-gotten gains in that way, typically it's handed back to whoever the individuals were. But if it was a action that was like a service or a rendering of like profit because of those illicit actions, then they will seize those assets and then they will hold them for some later time that they'll start to sell that. And if anybody remembers some of the history back in like 2012, we're talking like Tim Draper kind of got some exposure of who he was because he was buying and bidding on some of those first asset forfeitures that were happening with like the Silk Road as an example. So part of the discussion back then was, why is the government selling the Bitcoin? Shouldn't they just hold on to it? Who knows what the regulatory environment's going to be in the future? And it just makes sense that if they were ever going to include this in the Treasury Department or even go that round, just go long on Bitcoin. But that decision making at an administration level and then the execution of what the roles and responsibilities are for somebody like asset and forfeiture is asset forfeiture ain't looking at policy like that. They're just looking like, I have a job to do, and there's a schedule that we need to sell this stuff, and we're just going to go and do our job, right? So stuff started getting listed, it gets done in tranches, and then they sell it as to not impact or have a negative effect on market. So that's done in these little small buckets. Those have happened since essentially 2012 with Bitcoin. And there's X amount of Bitcoin left. I don't know what the total is. I would assume very soon we're going to hear what that strategic reserve amount is, or what the potential is, and if there's any existing scheduled events where they're going to go ahead and post that up. I'm assuming those are going to get canceled, right? Unless, the current administration, goes to try to sell all of that stuff before the handover of the transition of power. I doubt they'll do that, but who knows? I mean, it could be one of these things of like, we're going to sell that, and just make sure asset and forfeiture sells those coins and then just clears out all the Bitcoin before. I don't think that'll happen, but it is something that could until January 20th, right? So whatever is in the current reserve, that being transitioned over to Treasury and then being held as a government strategic asset, that will have a few things that they have to do. So they're going to have to select a set of personnel that will handle that transition. There's a current transition team in place right now for the Trump administration, and they're handling appointments. There's 4,000 plus appointments that they're having to get through. Part of that is to look and appoint advisors that are going to have that as a belly button. I mean, they need a belly button that's going to handle that kind of activity. And that is initially a basic set of guidance that would normally be put forth. That can be done through a executive order post January 20th. However, they could start to get the framework in place to, select the personnel, appoint advisors, background in technical, crypto technical support. I mean, this could be folks from like Coinbase, the engineers, to explain like how does cold storage work. Are they going to use somebody like Iron Mountain, some other company, to store these keys offline, having a multi-key signature set up, and then just these wallets essentially distributed and supported by, a process that's maybe a third party. And then is there going to be tagging? I think that personnel and that strategy will be, if the Bitcoin coins that are going to move from asset and forfeiture, or if the government's going to create a purchase plan, such as what happened with El Salvador, where they have a regular buy schedule. They're dollar cost averaging in. They buy, I think, a Bitcoin or more per day into perpetuity, right? So is the U.S. government going to do something like that? Or are they going to get into mining? There's a whole bunch of inputs that could increase the strategic reserve stockpile once they establish that. That transition team should be working on some level of communication strategy right now. I'm assuming they're literally sitting down, figuring out how they're going to handle that. And that is really around, you can't panic a market. You also want to manage expectations to where you're not pumping the market too hard either, because the reaction of why we're at all-time highs right now is because the speculation that the government's going to do these things that Trump set out for, right? Part of that speculation also is what could be the strategies on that Bitcoin stockpile. What does that mean? It means taking existing assets that are not hitting the market. That would not have a direct effect on pushing price because you already have it. It's a hodl. It's kind of a forced hodl. So you're not pulling more supply, thereby pumping price. It's purely a speculative increase that if the government gives a true blessing that there is a strategy and a purpose and a path, meaning they would move those coins into a strategic reserve wallet, and technically they could meta tag each of those as like strategic stockpile, wallet 1, wallet 2, wallet 3, whatever, and then now have an accountability publicly that is U.S. strategic reserve, and you would have a auditable proven known reserve that is tagged appropriately. Now, the pseudonymous nature of Bitcoin's UTXO architecture and structure provides the government could be totally quiet about it, not tag anything, let them know. But considering the government is working for the people and has this new kind of incentive and push to be more transparent, I can see that strategic reserve getting some kind of meta tagging, and then having some kind of multi-signature support to ensure that there's no single point of failure on the keys to those coins. The critical path pieces there is going to have a couple different elements. You'll have your cold storage stuff, and then there's going to have to be a strategy for a warm storage. The basic idea of holding coins in that kind of nature over a long period of time would be making sure that you can also pay down debt. So, because some of the things that were said by Trump was that we could leverage the Bitcoin strategic stockpile in a way that allows us to start to move away from this crazy debt that we have, that we've ran up, and use the growth of Bitcoin as a mechanism to start paying down debt. So then that means there would have to have some kind of strategy on sells, if that is to other countries, if there's Bitcoin in lieu of some of that debt. So whoever we owe that debt to, could they use Bitcoin in that nature? And then now you would have this transparent kind of like, hey, we paid it down. No kidding. Here's the coins that were associated to that. It's very oblique in the ossification that happens on the US dollar side is that it's like a trust me, bro. Like, oh, we paid down our debt. Well, I mean, maybe we see that. It goes through SWIFT. It goes through all these different counterparties. We don't see the transparency. With Bitcoin, you could start to have this potential where if you settle debts, you create debt with large Bitcoin tranches to show the metadata of the transaction. You could now have this independent accountability that you could just refer to and have a whole structure and indexing, as it were, from a government standpoint. I'm not saying this is for people, because essentially what I'm talking about is like a CBDC, but forcing Bitcoin into a CBDC. That's not what I'm talking about. From a personnel, individual participant, worldwide participant, U.S. citizen participation, it's still a pseudonymous coin, right? Like if I want to hold coin forever and then take it to Coinbase, I go through an AML KYC process, pay tax at that time when I'm going to sell. It's either long-term, short-term gains. It's pretty straightforward. With the government making government to government action or government to business action, you could open up the transparency because you could settle in something like Bitcoin. It does allow payment rails to have a little more open visibility. You don't have to trust an institution if you see a Bitcoin wallet transferring with some metadata, and then the receiver of that is correspondingly signing that message to say, yes, this settles this particular debt. It just changes some of the options from a larger country debt aspect if they did the framework around something like that. And it's super easy to set up. Like, this isn't, everything I'm talking about speculatively is not hyper complex. For 14 years, it's been happening on Bitcoin. There's been registries for property that people have done in Bitcoin transactions that they can go back forever in perpetuity to know that, did I transfer any of those assets or own that particular bill of lading, a particular title. There's a lot of use cases in relation to the metadata that comes with a Bitcoin transaction that you could then tag and have reference to, and not have to have some data center that loses the information or any of that. You can embed that information in the Bitcoin network. So there is some awesome functionality that could be tapped on with the right personnel. And hopefully the transition team is looking at those sorts of things when it comes to the Bitcoin stockpile stuff. They're going to have to build guidelines. They're going to have to build hold policies that are not surprising a market, right? There is a little more due diligence when you're talking about a government uh, going through a cell or hitting, especially if they're selling to market, there's going to be rules and guidelines from a government aspect on that they'll have to get through. Again, that's kind of a transition strategy as they go to set up this either department or a handful of people that are going to run this aspect. The interesting thing is you don't need a huge amount of IT and support. And like when you think government contracts in general, and you think of the level of effort and the FTE development and the hierarchical design of that team or the staffing plan and all the things that come along with like a government agency, most of the IT aspects of this kind of thing is inherited by the network, like the accounting, the reference architecture, the design, the submission of transactions, all of those things that typically would be in like a cloud or in a government system. Essentially, they would have a reference system that's just reading the blockchain and then just creating that, wallet-to-wallet interaction, the metadata reader, all those kind of things. So you're not having this huge IT strategy to support anything I just said. It is literally just some adapters to read some data in and then have a framework that is almost like an interface agreement for like an API. It's not complicated. It's more the governance architecture of this is going to be a lot of that core structure of the setup. So when we talk about like strategic reserve, it means some things. It's great, but the makeup of that team and then the buildup of the capabilities should be like any other, development activity where you're setting up who's going to do it, who's going to handle this, and then have a feature list of what's going to be available and when. Very first one is probably just going to be moving some coin and tagging it as reserve, and here's the numbers. Going forward is some of the stuff I just talked about, where they would have other features come online, other companies being able to interact, governments that could then communicate from a servicing of debt, all those type of things could then be accounted for as part of that strategy for that stockpile. So I'm super interested in like where this is going. This is why we're having this live stream to kind of talk through where they could and who's going to represent it. Essentially, it's going to be a coordination between the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, and then some of those other offices like Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC. You got FINRA, you got FinCEN, you got IRS. There's going to be a lot of interactions, at least from each of these subcategories that we're going to talk about today and how it fits within their policies. And it is going to be some new. I mean, there's been a lot of folks trying to push it to legacy. And I think this is where like folks like Gary Gensler and some of the SEC stuff get caught around the wheels on it is when you're taking like a Howey test, you're taking the frameworks of security, you're taking CFTC, and you're taking some of the rulemaking on that. Some of this stuff is new, some of it's not new in aspects of like digital assets, but this is a drive and innovation that does have a potential to change some of those like boxed rules because of the lack of requirement on the overhead of like IT systems, cybersecurity, all these other elements you're inheriting from the system now. Like it's not on-prem, it's literally off-prem, but you can have a local node that you can assign all your actions to. And it just takes some refactoring of that wiring on how, contracting works on this, how they're going to build these teams, and then really where the seams are at. And in this transition team, they should have somebody there looking at the seams between these agencies, looking at the seams of the tech stack, and then how essentially there's like 4 things they need to answer on each of those seams. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed, right? So that's they call a RACI chart, RACI. And they need to answer that for each of those seam elements on what each group is going to do. This isn't a super complex activity. This is what typical solution architects do. So the personnel that should be sitting down and building this out is literally like a whiteboard session, drawing boxes and saying, let's throw some stuff up on a wall and see what sticks. What are the swim lanes you need to lay out of who needs interaction? what's the public need to see, what's the private sectors, how do people interact with it. All of these things are what's happening right now, what I would assume is happening right now on this administration, right now on the transition team when it comes to crypto, is somebody is figuring out all this solution architect work. That is the critical path to get some of this stuff through right now. So let's move on to, because I could sit here and talk all day about stockpile and all that sort of activities. Let's go into the second point of this. Again, this is a link below in the description. We're kind of going through the stuff. SEC chair, pro crypto regulation and leadership. I did single out the SEC on this versus having FINRA and FinCEN and all these other activities that guidance that's going to have to come to those other agencies. SEC is a real big one because it is on the security side of new assets. There's new crypto assets coming out all the time. There's capital raises that are happening on different assets. Even Mr. Trump himself put out his own coin, which, what's the utility purpose? Is it just a notoriety thing? Is it like a baseball card? How's that fall in this new digital world when it comes to SEC, promise for growth, all that sort of thing? And there's some serious questions that need to be answered, not just by the SEC, but some of the other agencies that have to look at the aspects that talk to digital rights use. When we start talking to NFTs, fair market use of images, pictures, all this is all falls in this crypto regulatory framework aspect. And it is, I know there's an entire swath of people that are like, dude, who cares? We don't need to overregulate this. Like the DGens are working out fine. The realities is that the incentive is built in for people to screw each other. And there are behaviors and people in this world that will make good money bad by just doing malicious activities, tricking you, making changes to things, pumping a coin, all these kind of things that you kind of want to make sure you have some kind of handle on, because until you're on the receiving end of getting screwed over, you may be super, free market, very liberal on your ideology on the regulatory side of it. And then you're going to do something that may screw you. And then you're like, well, wait a minute here. There needs to be regulation on this, right? So I think there's a balance. I think the very first person that should be selected for something like an SEC leadership really looks at this as its own thread. There are some seams that it can connect to because, just like logistics or anything that is normal between all industries, it has a framework. There is a framework to this that does correspond with legacy finance. Looking at those, but then moving on to what is not. So it's essentially like a SWOT diagram or like a swim lane diagram of like what is in this box and what is out of this box. And then because there's a handful of things that are out of this box from a regulatory standpoint, it needs to be its own thing. So having a pro kind of, I want to say pro crypto, the basic idea is somebody that is familiar with crypto, that respects crypto, that understands where its place in the world is, what it's accomplishing from a seamless transition between borders, all those sorts of things, a decentralized activity when it comes to like its security model, to where it's already incentivizing people to participate, where you don't have to have somebody paid to participate. It is literally built into the tool. The software itself is compensating you to participate. So understanding the separation of crypto and then legacy finance, and then just creating a new set of rules related to digital finance. And, putting a nominee in there that understands the key financial oversight roles of all those roles, and doing essentially that RACI chart and that swim lane analysis to understand what is responsible regulation, what is responsible deregulation. They're essentially buckets, like what's crap, what doesn't work, telling people to come in and you work with them for a little bit and then turning around and suing them is not a good way to do business. Maybe a call and saying, hey, what you're doing here is not it, right? And here's why. And then working with people to find a good, really good, regulatory framework that keeps everybody protected on both sides is a fair approach to it. But you also don't want to waste people's time. Like, you gotta get in there, get out, figure out a path forward and move on. And then it's agile. Like, this basic idea is that, you get into the concept of like hard lines, and then you can't change them in a digital evolving world is very hard. So you need some kind of agile development on that. You need a release schedule on that lets people understand when regulations are going to be coming in, how to comply with them, and all the support that's required and behind that for people to onboard and make changes to their systems. And what I'm saying from like an SEC standpoint is they would set that framework in place for folks that want to, like, let's say, raise capital through making a meme coin or something to that effect. Or they just want to make a meme coin. Maybe there's an entire new set of regulation when it comes to SEC that is literally what I would call kind of you have all the controlled and environment stuff, which is like where everything's being forced into the SEC. And then what is the craziness of establishing this out of box ideology where this is a deregulated aspect over here and you have zero protections? Just come right out and say zero protections on this side. You want to let memers do meme coins? Understand you have zero protections, consumer protections, and it is like a test bench at the end of the day. Like you can do all, like if you think of just normal development process within a government, your test area is wide open. You can do whatever you need to do. You can try all these things with all this crazy security requirements, because you're trying to form the thing that you need to develop, and then you go in and maybe you inherit some of the security and some of the zero trust architecture stuff. You're inheriting it from the beginning, but like legacy old stuff, maybe you have an access control list, maybe you're just have a stored password because you're trying to do some edits, and then you're going to integrate it into whatever framework, website, portal, and it's going to inherit, the whole roles-based access controls and all these other things. But while the developer's working on it, he's kind of working with like a set of clay, and he's not at the point where he needs to have all this other regulatory kind of, think of it like a Lego. It's like tap in. He's working in a common space. I look at meme coins and all this other stuff and all this discovery of what could crypto be. There is a place for that, and people need to know, like, if you cross that gate, hey, bro, good luck. Don't spend too much money on it because it's probably going to go to zero. And that is a deregulation space that allows innovation. You need to have that. You need to have a place where people feel, because if you do provide that and give the guidance and understanding, I think you get way more innovation than we even have right now. Because now people know, like, hey, there's a lot of really super smart people in there that don't take the chances, that are not developing new things because they're like, it's not regulated. And if I do this, like, am I at risk? And they potentially could be, like an Einstein level innovator, and they're just not doing it because they maybe grew up and had the guidance from family or people to like do things don't take chances, be frameworked into this thing, and they're going to be superior performers in, I don't know, you can call it Ivy League schools, but they're like just naturally super smart, but will not take the chance and risk because there's no regulation on this stuff. So then you take the folks that are super also enabled, and then they do take the risk. So you're only getting a portion of what your potential is because you don't have framework. So I'm looking at it from that aspect of like, there needs to be a space. So a pro SEC chair that looks at the innovation and says, not only am I just saying I'm giving you innovation, I'm providing you a framework that allows for the meme coins to go crazy, right? And let's see what happens from that. And then it kind of disassociates the lines on when you have like a very pro only Bitcoin person, Bitcoin maxi, and they're just like, you know what, that's the other side of the fence we don't have to ever be on. But like, it's not trying to mix the messages between both sides now. There's a clear strategy on established framework coins, or there's established interaction on that aspect. So I think that's a key piece for somebody to have that ideology on the SEC. And then how does that work in like a new digital approach to some of these assets? right now I would take a hard assumption that the transition team's looking at who's going to be that new SEC chair. I think we all know that it's probably not going to be Gary Kinsler. But who knows? Like they're going to take forward what their goals are on that and get that. I think the early stages of that is going to be a very big tie into Trump. Trump sounds like he's going to be very tied into a lot of the decision making when it comes to this crypto. We'll see if that's really the case. He's got a lot to tackle. Crypto is not the only thing on his platter right now. There's a lot of very important issues that he's going to get to in the country. And I think it's one aspect, but it looks like it's going to be pretty tied to, what he's paying attention to. Let's transition to the Bitcoin Advisory Council. This, I think, by design is made to, from my understanding of the way I've read into it so far, is the selection process for this looks like it's going to be across a couple different dimensions. So essentially, I can see this happening in some divisions. So you're going to have a mining aspect to this, proof of work, because there is so much tied to like critical infrastructure in that. Then having like just a financial, just a direct financial and treasury kind of hook to it, that will then be the feeder of some of the advisory stuff that we're talking about. So you can think of it like a board type of position. I think this is the way this is going to go down. And then that would then have its technical feeders and support from a hierarchical setup standpoint. And what I did on this third point is, in the link that's in the description, I have broken that down into what I would think from a staffing plan. I've been really playing with this for the last few days since Trump was selected. I was thinking, okay, how would that crypto advisory group look? And again, if I was king for a day, how would I structure it? How do you get the lines of communication? How do you get the expertise? How do you get the because you need like somebody managing it from like a project management standpoint, PMO office, but you also need a clear line of like what's the goals, and then you also need kind of like division chiefs, as it were, on those different sectors, because you don't want like while I feel super comfortable in a couple areas in this space, I am not an expert in a handful of other items in the crypto space for sure. Like if we get into like Solana and some of these other proof of stake coins, like I understand and respect the technology and the efforts that have went forth to build some of the on-ramps, the bridging activities, the layer 2, layer 3, the changes in the way you would do like shielded transactions, all that stuff. I understand the technical aspects of it, but the ideology, where it can go, NFT, I'm not your guy. Like there are other people that are way smarter than that understand the ethos around it and the potentials and some of the use cases that are happening on chain. Like that needs to, like you have like your hardware crypto regulatory guy with real world experience in the mining deployment, all the idiosyncrasies that come with power contracts, engagement, maintenance, zoning, permitting, sound, impacts to environment, like when it comes to like the sound environment aspects of it, machine waste, regulatory stuff that probably needs to come down on some of the ASIC manufacturers, just from there's no consumer protections. We all know like Bitmain's parts fell and then it's like impossible to get service on them. Like there's some things that need to be looked at on that aspect from like a consumer trade, the consumer trade division essentially for the government, FTC, Federal Trade Commission. Jesus, it took me a second to remember that. So like FTC requirements, that sort of thing. Versus somebody that's going to do the soft side of it, the software side of it, interaction, versus on the crypto division being somebody that's going to do on the financial regulatory aspects, right? So there's going to be divisions under that advisory council that are going to have experts that will talk on behalf of what the impacts on all those are. And so that the issues and solutions probably are going to be mostly around policy making initially, which provides framework, and then you can get into the nuance of the details of some of those policies, right? So the people's actually going in. So having a primary program management head division guy that is just extremely. I almost think of that person like a solution architect or a developer, somebody that just has an overarching view of all the aspects of crypto. And then you get into your product managers or your people that are the heads of office in those particular things. You also don't want a huge amount of bloat, but you need belly buttons that can handle these divisions, right? You need somebody that goes, you're the guy for this, or you're the girl for this. And, what's your gut check? And then who are your people that you're getting your data from, right? I think that there needs to be a strategic initiatives manager, somebody that's making sure things are moving. It's kind of like the scrum master in development, but for this advisory council, somebody that's keeping things on. They have a scrum board, Kanban board, whatever, and saying, we told the public we're doing this. How are we tracking on these things? And make that as much as you can transparent, right? I'm not saying getting crazy like having KPIs, but making sure timelines are met. I mean, Trump is a very business-focused person. He thinks, obviously, as a strategic business leader. So he's going to have his cross-divisional coordination. He's going to have his points of staff that are giving him the stuff quick. He doesn't have time to have a massive, long conversation when he's going through this stuff. So you got to be able to concise it down, have your milestones, have your delivery. It's we used to have something on some of our deliveries that we used to do, and we have it called the lunch bunch. So we'd literally go in and just give a 30-minute quick sit rep on all the projects across like 9 different areas, 8 different applications. And then in those applications had all kinds of different, I had database stuff. I had interface agreement stuff, that might have multiple parties that I don't have control, people downstream. But we could consolidate that in 30 minutes. And then you'd get a leader that would have everything he needs right away. And you're just narrowing it down to the bottom line up front. They call it the bluff. And then having a risk and compliance. You're going to have an entire concept understanding of like risk and compliance that should be working with industry and government affairs people. Typically, you would see this as some of the lobbyist activities, because there's a difference of like execution on a plan, and then you have the lobbying activities that come into play, which are you're trying to shape a requirement. That's really what at the end of the day lobbying ends up being. It's just saying, hey, got this idea and we want to form this thing, or we need to have this rule adjusted, and here's why. And most of the time that's probably self-serving to those individuals that are doing that. But it doesn't mean that you can't have that activity if you're putting on a Kanban board and say, hey, Joe over here says we should try to do this. And you're not keeping it compartmentalized anymore. You're making it transparent. Throw your ideas on the wall. See what sticks. The person handling that, risk, compliance. So essentially you got your initiatives manager looking at all those requirements from the advisory council. And then you got your risk guy going, how's this going to impact risk, right? And that's just staying compliant with regulatory standards and just handling risk mitigation. Sometimes risk mitigation is just schedule slips, right? Like, crap, we were going to meet here, and then Congress only meets during these times. It's the scheduler, the guy that's just sitting there making sure, can we get this done in time? I think you're going to have the financial division, right? Somebody's handling the CFO of that. It's probably going to be an I would assume, exchange person or somebody big that understands the financial planning, asset management. Got budgetary forecasting, financial models to those crypto assets, history, structure. I think one of the big compliance things that are going to come down is, and I think this is why when people always ask me, like, why do you talk about Ravencoin? Why do you talk about Litecoin, Dogecoin, proof of work coins? Any coin that was fair market launched, meaning a code was produced, it was put onto a Bitcoin Talk post and said, hey, I got this thing. I can't influence the development of Bitcoin to do this particular function. Then somebody created a new coin. The initial and first coins that were created, when we were talking Litecoin being the second kind of coin, you had Pure Coin, you had Cure Coin, you had Name Coin. You had these different coins that original purpose wasn't to try to get rich on. They were saying there's a base set of functionality using proof of work that does this amazing, social experiment to see about individual participation, the ability to transfer wealth between 2 points. But is there an opportunity to maybe take that framework that is incentivized to uphold by the token that's in it and then add other functionality on top of it, right? And this is where I kind of go awry with like Bitcoin maxis on. It's like you need to have innovation, and the fact that Bitcoin does what it does, and it's fantastic. It is the gold standard on this whole entire industry. That being said, there are other things that bring other use cases that leverage the tech stack. And that tech stack provides now new opportunity for other functions that typically are nested in a on-premise or a cloud or a third-party company you have to pay money for that could go away at some point. That then you've lost your infrastructure and you've lost the purpose of whatever you were doing, because now you've lost your infrastructure behind it, because maybe things move away from clouds and they go back into like a mesh or something. Having innovation on top of that to maybe bring in like Namecoin for like namespaces, you have or like effectively directory services. Think of it like DHCP, but for crypto, right? There's some innovation that came with those things, right? Purecoin, same thing. Purecoin was initially an incentive to innovate protein folding and those sorts of things but be an incentivized activity, kind of like folding at home, where you can have these very cool interactions of being a decentralized participant and supporting an initiative, but you're also compensated for it because it's built into the mechanism of it. So tying proof of useful work to a cryptocurrency, and the useful work that's the output of what the functionality of the network is, you're compensated because you're also threading the security layer of that network, right? That's what the purpose of some of those other tokens were initially. You had Feathercoin, same thing, fair market launch, community-based coin. Now that was more kind of an incentive structure-based one that was looking for a kind of on the heels of Bitcoin and just purely a fork of Bitcoin, different script algorithm originally. And then you had things like later on that came out with some more different level of ethos, like a Raven coin, which added functionality to have the asset management. So there's a one-to-many different sub-assets that are at a UTXO level, so it reduces the complexity compared to something like Ethereum, where there's smart contracts and there's a little more risk when you start adding a more complexity, splitting the database up. It's kept at a layer one UTXO framework, and it has opportunity to maybe do something like stock market exchange on its framework because it was designed to support those kind of activities. So again, built-in incentive to hold the network, just like Bitcoin. However, it has secondary and tertiary effects on the platform itself, right? So that's what I'm talking about. It's not a speculation as this is a coin going to moon. Maybe it does because of the scarcity that's built into it. That being said, it had a different purpose. It had a purpose to facilitate a function. That function would have tertiary effects on being able to bring other revenues in with regards to the activities that you're doing on the chain, right? So it does have that innovation. Those kind of things need the folks that are going to be part of that advisory council needs to have that level of understanding of the purpose of what some of these coins were and what the functionality is, almost kind of like a traceability matrix of like, here's the functionalities of the coin, here's the underlying algorithm, here's its issuance schedule, here's its features, here's what's been tested, here's what the roadmap is, who's supporting it, is it open source? All of those kind of things go onto that matrix. And there's some financial institutions that do capture some of that stuff. CoinMarketCap does and has some basic outline of that. But actually from a investment strategy, portfolio management, controller, audit, compliance, all those guys that have to maintain those kind of things, they understand where that's at. And then are any of those going to have a value proposition from a long-term hodl standpoint? Does it fit the scarcity aspects? And I think the Litecoins, the Dogecoins of the world, the Raven coins of the world are in that kind of class of thing. I look at Ethereum, Solana, and all those as different. They're different type of network. Their token was made for spend, right? Spend and burn, right? So the basic concept is that you go and execute something, and then that execution's burn of that token is tied up in that transaction ID, and you can see that there was it was fuel, and you could think of it like fuel. That's why Ethereum, some of these other tokens like Ethereum, I don't know if Cardano has an upper limit, but Solana, that they'll always produce into perpetuity. They're not a scarce asset with regards to supply, because their basic concept is like fuel. They're going to get spent. Different use case, different set of other features where you now have the ability to tie other tokens and stuff. So somebody that's you're essentially the finance division, the treasury division in that council that's going to understand from a hodl or a spend aspect, what's the features of the technology stack. That will then align with an IT division. So you're essentially going to have like your PMO, your people, your project managers. Again, this is all speculation. I don't know if this is the way they're going to do this. This is if BBT was king for a day, and how I would staff an advisory council. And maybe somebody will share this video with the transition team, and I can help maybe a couple points for them. The understanding that there is not just the soft skills or the knowledge skills, that you need to have some technical skills in there too. You're going to have, cybersecurity compliance, people that align the tech stack and any interaction with this advisory council. If that's an SE&I person, so that'd be like systems engineering and infrastructure person that understands those ties into it, and then can provide that detail and architectures. So typically when we build architectures for like something like a government, you do something called an OV1 or an OV6, all through an OV6. So it's operational view. And then there's like layers 1 through 6, different complexities. You can think of it like an overview map that starts very high level. And then as you drill down, you get to see kind of how things are wired up. It's a specification guide. When you develop software, it's pretty normal. You didn't know how the machine works. How's the plumbing work? But you can also do this from structural planning, staffing planning, understanding level of effort, understanding who you need, and then having an agile process that is like being able to understand like when you need something and then make change appropriately, right? So those kind of things I think are going to be critical. They're going to need, if this was a business, it would be a CFO, a head of treasury, and then like a CTO kind of division in that advisory council that are fulfilling those roles. And those CTOs would have like mining operations, blockchain development team, systems integration, security. You'd have those different teams that would then fill in the technical knowledge. And they're not probably full-time. This is probably not a full-time job for some of those technical people. They're just in time when they need it. But you're going to want that experience. And this is, you got to have an all-star team. Like the transition team needs to hire an all-star team for this. And because it would be the best representation for our crypto community. It should be advocates in this space that have been in it for a long time, understand the nuance to it, understand the risk if they go one way or another. What can they actively pull to the industry? What can they, what's the test look like? What's the, execution strategy look like, And then in closing of that crypto advisory council, I think and it's probably one of the most important pieces there is the policy division. So you take these kind of feeder sources of tech stack, finance, treasury impacts, worldview impacts, what's it do to the dollar versus other currencies, how does trade work, how does all the tariff aspects, all of the, I wouldn't call it bad actors, but if you have countries that don't get on the same page or are part of what would be considered as the legacy access is evil, I think that dynamic's going to be adjusted here. I think with this different foreign policy approaches of trying to get people in line to make changes and do things, but also have a aspect of what's the like what could you do to get them compliant with, sanctions, all that kind of stuff? Or, how do you handle sanctions? You need a policy person to understand policy lead development, compliance, oversight management, legal counsel, public relations, foreign relations. These are different areas on that advisory council that will then be feeders to other groups. And mind you, it's not like you're recreating the entire will separately for crypto. This is again an advisory council, but there's going to be feeder and what they would call dotted lines to the appropriate divisions in the government, right? So CFTC, FINRA, FinCEN, OCC, SEC, all these different divisions. And then you're also going to have it into, NATO, you'll have it in Department of Defense, State Department. You'll have all these different other subdivisions that need to get a consumption from it. And the ability to get that information where it's relevant to those different departments is going to be a strategy that somebody's going to have to understand and have it all hierarchical out in that OV1, OV6 kind of view, right? So that is the framework that somebody like me, like a solution architect, would go and build in a pretty short order. Like this isn't like years of development. This is months, if not weeks of development locked in a room, right? If like for at least the initial phase, like the rough draft, the first view that then you can throw darts at and go as we start, because essentially you got to get the framework out there, who the staffing is, the basic concept, and then you got to play out the scenarios. You got to what they call use case development. So now you start going, okay, cool story. We got this architecture framework, people. Where was the dial on the policy side? What's the regulatory comfortability? What's AML, KYC work? How do bad actors work in this from forensics and enforcement action? Then you start playing out the full bake scenario. You have a scenario guide, and then when you start playing that forward, and this is the way, again, I think a lot of this is akin to like a software development project. I always try to align that between that and logistics. I always look at those two different elements. And part of that's like the Black Belt Six Sigma, Green Belt Six Sigma stuff, where you're kind of watching a process flow and you start to go, okay, I'm not going to invent a use case for this. I'm going to take a real world thing and I'm going to play it against this new layout that I have. How would this flow? Who would be touched? Who would be talked to? Those type of things. And then, is there an oversight manager? Is there international policy analyst? Is there a regulatory affairs manager? How do they interact with the businesses in the world? Those core responsibilities, you need to have belly buttons on them. You need to have hiring that is able to vet quickly and get those appointed. All of that infrastructure and all those people need to have an understanding from a charter aspect. They got to have what's their purpose, all that. And then you start playing those scenarios out and you end up having some that work, some that are like, holy shit, why weren't we doing this the whole time? To then some like, here's why this doesn't work. And I think that's where you get into your communication manager people, and then your communication people can then speak to, the advisory council, and then ultimately maybe to the American people, to the world, and say, you know what, let's play this game out. Let's go on Joe Rogan and let's play through this scenario. And let's explain to somebody like Joe Rogan on a long format podcast, like why this thing that everybody thought would work, here's why it doesn't, right? Here's why certain things break down when we start to actually play it forward. And anybody that's ever built anything realizes like that first plan, you end up on plan Z, not plan A, right? And it's because a whole bunch of things that happen along the process, and maybe you had the capacity to capture all those things, or maybe it's just the big ones you stick out, but playing it out in front of everybody is seeing what really works. This effectively is, from my understanding, is what like Elon Musk and their groups do, from when you think first principles type of thing, where you're just playing it forward, you're seeing what works, what doesn't, you're making quick decisions. You're not going to have a committee to sit there and go cycles of trying to make something work, a square peg round hole. If you find something that doesn't make sense, you nuke it, you move on. And you might end up back in almost the same place, but let the process go through its first principles concept, right? That'll get you through that piece. I think that's one of the key pieces on the policy side of it. Now, the overlay, once that's kind of set up from the transition team, then we should start seeing appointments, hiring. The regulatory meetings, are they going to be public? Is there going to be public hearing kind of things, that sort of thing? And then what's the overarching goals, and were they accomplished, and can they be talking points, later in the year from a guidance standpoint? When can these things come online? I think is another really key piece there. So I kind of went through really quick on the advisory piece. Let's go ahead and jump over now back to the last few that I have here. And let me know in the comments, guys, or if you guys like this. I'm trying to just let this flow. I've been thinking about this one for a long time. Somebody that's been in this space for a long time. I've played many scenarios in my head of how this would ultimately come down. And I would say from a barometer and a temperature, I'm very optimistic in this space, even more so than I've ever been, because of some of the things that have been said. And I think you can see that even though Trump in the first administration was not very pro crypto, I think it was still very nuanced, and there wasn't enough people that had access to him to kind of onboard him and kind of orange pill him. But I think he's an observer, and he has observed the market do what it's done, the expansion of this space, and he's made now a decision to be in some capacity part of it and provide guidance when it comes to the country. And I think that's a very positive thing for this industry. We may not like every result that comes out of it, but I think that's a big, huge critical piece of it. In that. And, it leads me into this number 4 bullet that I have. And again, these are down in the description below of what I'm kind of going through here, guys. The US-based mining, and where does this go from here? From an energy dominance, from a security architecture with Bitcoin. If the US government's going to put Bitcoin in a strategic reserve in the US Treasury, the basic understanding is, okay, how do we secure that? And not just the multi-key signature stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying they're understanding that the Bitcoin security, the mining aspect, is the security layer. And they're going to have a vested interest in that. How does that manifest? And having a person on that advisory council that really understands it. I'm going to say this out there because there's a lot of people I know and respect in the Bitcoin mining space on the publicly traded side. I do not want to see, me personally, somebody that's in the publicly traded Bitcoin space as like the core Bitcoin mining person, because I think we run into a risk if the incentive is to centralize the mining under publicly traded companies. The basic ideology is that there needs to be a framework that lets everybody participate, does not give any earmarked advantage to a publicly traded company. It's just a very base set of rules from maybe how we would interact with public infrastructure. Meaning what we've cultivated around our area. I'll give us kind of a basic scenario and wrap us back in. Kind of doing what I guess Donald Trump does with the weave or whatever, because I'm telling you a major point and I'm coming down and I'm going to break it out in the scenario real quick and then we'll fold it back in. When we're out here developing with a local power company and we're explaining to their board on how things work, both mechanically from the NEC level, so the National Electrician committees, making sure we're NEC compliant, making sure that we're safe on substations, making sure our people are educated and wear PPE, all those things that we're just innately doing to stay safe and compliant. Not everybody necessarily does that. So those are the kind of rules that I'm talking about. Like saying, if you're going to be on a substation, if you're going to be working with high three-phase power and you're an individual group, here's the basic rules. Most of us fall into the NEC rules and the things that are already in place from a regulatory, permitting, and zoning aspect. But if you're going to have a separately zoned concept of Bitcoin mining, because it's a high load factor, 3-phase kind of work, and even some other personal or home mining, then that regulatory framework is kind of more of just the rules of the road, of just like how to get on, how to get active, how to be, if you're going to be on a power plant, if you're going to buy a power plant, like how that works with the grid and all that kind of stuff. That's the regulatory framework stuff I'm talking about. Having rules, or what New York did with like a bit license, all that, wrong approach for a whole bunch of reasons, but not limited to the fact that if you're putting any additional overhead on Bitcoin mining, you're disrupting its security model. Meaning, like, if you're going to make me pay for a separate license to mine, you've automatically caused me to be not competitive with the rest of the world that does not have that. And that's why you've seen a majority of the Bitcoin mining move out of New York the moment they started putting all those Bitcoin license stuff in place. A lot of stuff out of Niagara Station. They effectively put overhead that did not need to be there because they were trying to extrapolate some kind of extra cash. Bitcoin mining is a different animal. It is literally a decentralized participation, meaning you want to have the lowest cost possible that still pays people fairly and can compete in the rest of the world. And while it might be a little more expensive than certain places in the other world, because we work with people all over the world on this, I am trading the stability of the U.S. market and maybe the substation and the power for maybe a little more cost than if I was mining in another country that maybe had a little less regulatory rules, but as also it's in a country that I necessarily might not have full property rights on. Somebody could literally roll up and I have some kind of domestic dispute internally there on the site. You run into all this other nuance and potentially in other countries that you would not have in the US because the rules are a little more refined, right? So people will competitively mine Bitcoin in the US because of those rule structures and the securities that inherited with the rule of law in general and property rights and everything else. So there are people, and we've helped people have, go into the modeling of a potential location that looks like it's going to be 1 cent power, 2 cent power on essentially this, PDF docu-signed letter. But then when you really start to peel it back, it's like, there is no guarantee that rate's not going to adjust on you the second you put that mine in there. And they're not going to lock it in because they actually don't have, the confidence that they could uphold that. They don't have the confidence they can protect you if somebody comes in and claims your space. I've had a couple different situations like that where people have called me and said, hey, we built this thing, and then now, a local group is demanding that we pay them too because we're in their territory, that type of thing. So there is, the U.S. market is a very positive market for this. Europe could be, but they keep shutting down all their power plants. Australia, there's a lot of other countries out there that have potential to become, Bitcoin mining, meccas. Power subsidies and stuff like that gets into dangerous land. And so you got to have somebody that understands on how that works and how you can upset the apple cart on that. But having a really good, very deeply knowledgeable Bitcoin mining person is absolutely critical on that council and in this space, and having some guidance to where they understand energy producing states versus consumption states. They understand the economic security that Bitcoin brings, of being part of that, and then having a stake in the game, as it were, mechanically with its security, right? I think there's going to be some big work that's going to be done on the Bitcoin mining scene. There's a huge amount of influence in this, especially in several states that I know that have senators that are mining. Ted Cruz is mining himself as an example. And then the innovation that could come from like development of new energy sources, that kind of thing, and how do those impact particular environments and stuff. I think it'd be really, really important. There was a few other things covered in this. We're right here just over an hour. I'm going to start to wrap this one up. But again, we have, things in the description of things I've covered here. I think the last section I was going to talk about was like the lowering of the Fed rate and how does that help or support the crypto market, from like low cost cash to borrow, that kind of thing. We'll probably save that one for another live stream. But really, I mean, counsel, the bullish case for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, I think is here. And we'll see how this transition team works out. Feel free to share this if you guys felt that this was informative. If you want to know more on a particular topic, let us know. We do live streams every week, Fridays, noon. I've only missed one where we had to move it to a Saturday. And they're out there on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, or X, as it were. We're live streaming out there. And yeah, let me know, guys. Hopefully this was good. It looks like some of the good comments out there were good, and we'll bring you guys some more good content. Next week's on the Raven Coin Cruise. We'll talk some assets and future of other alternative currencies. We're out there with some of the other folks. So that's going to be kind of more like a panel kind of discussion. But hopefully this was good for you guys. I'm going to wrap this one up, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.